Welcome to the Monty Collier Report. I'm Monty Collier. In this video, I will be discussing GC Berkouwer and Dutch Mysticism's claim that the Bible has no information for us. Discussing the Bible's proclamation of salvation, GC Berkouwer writes the following in his 1954 book on justification, and I quote, "There is really no excuse for taking the edge off the seriousness of unbelief. The Scriptures, in their proclamation of salvation, allow us no other alternative than to see unbelief in its most disastrous proportions. They preach the necessity of faith, and do it with an urgency which is existential to the core. This is evident throughout them. They do not offer us a note of information. They come with an importunate message demanding an answer of faith. The insoluble relation offers the only possibility of preaching the sovereignty of grace and the earnestness of the call to faith. Here lies the real mystery of the way of salvation." End quote. Faith and Justification, Chapter 7, page 199. Notice Berkouwer claims that the proclamation of the law and the gospel is a message that threatens serious consequences for unbelief in the gospel, teaches the necessity of faith, yet offers not a note of information. Not a note. This is a standard contradiction espoused in the confused writings of Dutch mysticism. This is a standard attack on the Bible utilized by Dutch mystics. Now, in actual Calvinism, the Bible alone is the inspired, authoritative, and infallible information of God revealed to man. The Bible is made up of law and gospel. The law informs sinners that all men are guilty, are unable to do any good act, unable to keep the covenant of works for justification and their salvation, and if it is not rejected, the law points to Christ alone for salvation. The gospel informs us of God's free promise of grace alone in Christ alone for us. So, in matters of justification before God, to say that the Bible has not a note of information for us is outrageous heresy. The Dutch mystics have rejected Sola Gratia. When dealing with the irrational nonsense of Dutch mysticism, one has to remember that it is a standard claim in this asylum of ignorance that the Bible is filled with contradictions, i.e., irreconcilable paradoxes. Now, these mystics chant that all the teachings of the Bible of necessity appear to be contradictory. Even the moral teachings, think about that. For them, knowledge is simply impossible. So, do whatever you want. Berkouwer closes that confused paragraph I just read with an appeal to the mystery, that is, self-contradiction, that he finds in the call to believe the gospel. This is Berkouwer introducing the heretical position known as common grace, also known as the free offer of the gospel, FOG for short. Berkouwer continues, and I quote, "The mystery of the way of salvation exists in the call to the faith which expects everything and rests its all in divine grace. For divine salvation is preached in the urgent appeal." End quote. Page 200. The teaching of FOG is a staple in Dutch mysticism. While it cannot demonstrate its position from the Bible alone, FOG still pretends that God effectually purposes to save reprobates, whom he effectually purposes to damn, and that the reprobates will be saved if they use their will to believe the gospel. For Berkouwer and his friends, why God has eternally purposed to save those he eternally purposed to damn is a complete mystery, that is, contradiction. Dutch mystics think this contradiction on God's part, the doctrine of FOG, is expressed in the call to believe the gospel. Dutch mystics espousing FOG are either unaware or they simply don't care that commands to believe the gospel do not imply that God desires the salvation of those listening to the gospel. Why? Because commands do not imply anything. Commands are not propositions. If more people would take the time to read the first few pages of a basic textbook introducing deductive propositional logic, then perhaps Dutch mysticism would not dominate most nominally Reformed churches as it does today. Let it further be noted here that Berkouwer mixes the law and the gospel by claiming that divine salvation is preached in the urgent appeal, that is, the command to believe. Now, the command to believe is law, not gospel. The command to believe is a demand. It is the law that demands, not the gospel. The gospel declares the free grace of God in Christ alone for our justification. Berkouwer's mixing of law and gospel results in justification by faith and works. The doctrine of fog, the free offer of the gospel, also implies a conditional election and reprobation. It implies human free will apart from God's predestination. It asserts a denial of original sin and total depravity. Universal atonement is also hinted at in the doctrine of fog, and some of them, like John Murray in his book Redemption Accomplished and Applied, comes right out and says that there's a universal atonement mediation in some sense for the reprobate. Fog also asserts resistible grace and justification by faith and works. So like I said, this is all part of standard Dutch mysticism. It's repackaged Arminianism if you just want to be frank about it. In conclusion, there is no insoluble mystery between the doctrine of salvation by grace alone and the call to believe the gospel. Salvation by grace alone tells us what God did for our salvation by sending His Son, our surety, our only Redeemer, to live and die in our stead. You see, the gospel is declarative. And the call to believe the gospel informs us on what we should do, not what we can do, or what God has decreed to come to pass. For the law is imperative. Therefore, there is no tension between the two, for there is no irreconcilable paradoxical mystery that invincibly resists logical harmonization between the two. The Bible is logically consistent, and God is logical, not insane. God bless.